Pop Talkin' Aliens, the William Cleere podcast.
Yes, as usual. She's right. I'm William Cleere. Pop Talkin' Aliens, podcast, all of those things, all of the above. And you know what? Very special episode to me, because Elton John is turning 70 this month, 2017, March of 2017. And not only that, but something that I consider to be an even more notable milestone is that him and Bernie Taupin have been writing together for 50 years. They started in 1967. And if you're listening to this podcast, I assume that you know who Bernie Taupin is. I assume that you have enjoyed Elton's music, familiar with the albums to one extent or another. So you don't need me to go into a whole explanation of who Bernie Taupin is and so forth. But I am going to delve into Elton's career and their writing and how things went, sort of break the career down by era and talk about the growth and evolution of Elton John as an artist and of their material, their songwriting, the recording. This is not a biography. You know, you can buy an audiobook of a biography, I'm sure, and it'll be much more detailed and well-researched than I'm doing. The other thing about biographies that I always hate is I always hate that they start... I can't stand a biography that starts off with, like, Elton John was born in Pinner in 1947, and his father gave him a bunch of shit, and his mom divorced the dad, and he got a stepdad who encouraged him with his music along with his mom, and blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, I just kind of did it accidentally, but... Well, so now you know that part. Anyway, let's start from when they started writing, because it's 50 years. In 1967, you may know this story, but it goes like this. Elton John was Reg Dwight, is his given name, and he was playing in a band called Bluesology with a guy named Long John Baldry, a couple other dudes, a guy named Elton Dean, and he eventually took the name Elton Dean and the name Long John Baldry and made Elton John. So that's that part. But he was playing in this band through the mid-'60s, and they were playing little pubs, but they actually, I mean, they were supposedly pretty good musicians, and it was a good band. They would be the backup band for bigger acts that would come through England. So Patti LaBelle is an example of one of the bigger people that they supported. So like in those days, Patti LaBelle couldn't afford to be lugging a band all around England, so she would just send out charts to local bands for the local clubs that she was going to play, and then they would play her stuff for her. So she, different band every show. So they did things like that, and they did release their own material, and some of the songs were actually written by Reg Dwight, lyrics and music, although the lyrics are pretty indicative of why Elton John did not continue to write lyrics. One of the songs is called Come Back Baby. You can hear it online. It's on one of his box sets, and it's the lyrics of a 15-year-old, no doubt. Not horrible, but not very good. He wrote other lyrics to other songs that I don't think made the cut. Bernie Taupin has a famous quote where he quotes one of the lyrics that he saw scribbled down somewhere by Elton John that was called The Witch's House. And as Bernie Taupin quotes it, this Elton John lyric was, "I go to the witch's house. I go there whenever I can. Me and Molly Dickinson in my delivery van." So that kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Although, I don't know, if Syd Barrett wrote that, people might think it was genius, and they would analyze it and break it down, and I don't know. Anyway, 1967 rolls around. Elton John's getting sick of playing with Bluesology. He wants to break out on his own. He sees an ad for talent-wanted artists, recording artists, singers, writers, for this new company called Liberty Records that's breaking free of EMI. So he goes in there and he talks to this dude, Ray Williams, and he says, "Well, I don't really write lyrics, but I got all these melodies," and, shows him what he can do and so forth. And it just so happened that Ray Williams had been sent a stack of just lyrics by this guy from Lincolnshire named Bernie Taupin. And the story goes that Bernie Taupin had collected a bunch of, saw the ad, had collected a bunch of his lyrics and put it together in an envelope and then just left it there, thinking just was not going to send it. But his mom saw it and she sent it for him. So thank you to Daphne Taupin for facilitating this historic meeting. So Ray Williams just decided, you know what, here, take some of these lyrics from this dude and, see what you can do with them, and we'll see what we get. And so Elton John went off and started writing songs to Bernie Taupin lyrics, and he hadn't even met him. And he wrote a ton of stuff and then brought it back. Ray Williams was like, yeah, this is good stuff. Bernie Taupin comes in, they finally meet. Instant chemistry, listening to the songs that they wrote, and hitting it off. And the thing that's funny, too, is that to this day, that is still the case. When Elton John goes to write lyrics, or when he goes to write music, to Bernie Taupin lyrics, they don't do it in the same room. They actually have a song about that called Two Rooms at the End of the World. It's on the album 21 at 33. It's a double reference. It's a double reference to the fact that they write in two rooms, and At the End of the World is a reference to Captain Fantastic. From the end of the world to your town. But so to this day, Bernie Taupin will email or fax or whatever a bunch of lyrics to Elton John. He'll take a look, take him into the studio, start writing. Then Bernie Taupin comes into the studio, hangs out. Elton John says, hey, what do you think? He says, it's good. And they go record it. There have been little stories of once in a while, like Elton John will say, hey, can you fix this line or whatever, after he's written the melody. But there's no sit-down, brill building style, sleeves rolled up, suspenders, smoking cigarettes, laboring over a song. It's not like that. And it's wonderful. And they do it quickly. From the time that Elton John started writing music to Bernie Taupin lyrics, he was doing it in like a half an hour. It takes the dude like half an hour to write a song. Whether it's your song or some piece of shit song from Ice on Fire, generally half an hour, 45 minutes. So now that they've gotten a groove and they've written a bunch of songs, they got hired on by Dick James Records. Dick James had been involved with the Beatles, and Elton and Bernie were hired as staff songwriters, basically trying to write songs for Engelbert Humperdinck and people like that. The songs they were writing weren't that good. They weren't really writing their own stuff. They're trying to write these cheesy hits. And they didn't get recorded by a lot of big names at all. I think one of the ones I remember offhand is that they wrote a song called The Tide Will Turn for Rebecca. And it was recorded by Edward Woodward, whom you may know from The Wicker Man. The guy who gets burnt up in The Wicker Man, original, of course. And also played The Ghost of Christmas Present in the George C. Scott version of A Christmas Carol. Recorded The Tide Will Turn for Rebecca. But they weren't having a lot of success doing that. They weren't churning out hits for other people. And eventually, one of the guys who worked for publishing was named Steve Brown. He convinced Elton and Bernie to start recording their own stuff. And they would do so at the Dick James studio. Kind of, in off hours, they would record their own music, their own songs. One of them of note was called Lady Samantha. I'm not going to play a bunch of clips on the show because this is, it's more about the celebration of what they've done rather than, here, listen to this, listen to that. You can check it out. And also when I play clips, it fucks up the YouTube videos for this podcast because they start monetizing it and stuff. So, check out Lady Samantha if you want some history, if you haven't already heard it. Anyway, they got to the point where Steve Brown and the guys all decided to record a proper album. And this was 1968. And they were hanging out at Tin Pan Alley and, New Oxford Street was where the studios were all the time. It was the period of time that is captured in the album Captain Fantastic. The album Captain Fantastic takes place from 67 when they met up till 1970 or prior to 1970 when they released this album, which was Empty Sky. So they started recording these songs, which eventually became the album Empty Sky. Empty Sky was released to no fanfare in the UK. It was not released in the US. It was released in the US years and years later after Elton John had become a big hit, and the record company tried to squeeze a couple extra bucks out by posthumously releasing Empty Sky in 75 or 76, sometime right after Captain Fantastic. And it didn't do well that time either. It's not very good, as you can imagine. It doesn't have Elton John's and Bernie Taupin's voice. I don't mean literally, but I mean in the figurative sense of the songs that they write. There's not a lot of cohesion. It's kind of all over the place. It's produced weird. It's relies on those old tricks of putting the vocals on the right and the band on the left and weird stuff. It does have one song of note, which is Skyline Pigeon. Arguably the first song that Bernie Taupin and Elton John ever wrote of significance. It wasn't the first song they ever wrote together. First song they ever wrote together was called Scarecrow. And that's also referred to in Captain Fantastic. I used to know this old scarecrow. He was my song. That's what they're referring to there. It's interesting, as a side note, on the album Captain Fantastic, there are so many references that are very specific to what was going on at that time. But because we weren't around for the story, we weren't watching it develop in the media, we weren't familiar with all these songs they wrote and stuff that they reference in the last song, Curtains. So as an audience, it's kind of these esoteric lyrics that sound great and you don't know exactly what they mean. And that's part of what makes that album so good. One of many things. But it's interesting that in 2006, they went and wrote a sequel, quote unquote, to Captain Fantastic called Captain and the Kid. And lyrically, that album is very similar to Captain Fantastic. But one of the problems that a lot of people had with it was they said it's so specific. It's like, all these self-references to Rocket Man or the Yellow Brick Road or this or that or that. Everyone knew exactly what they were talking about, so it almost seemed self-indulgent. But the weird thing is, had you been following Elton John's career closely from 67 to 1970, you might have that same opinion about the original Captain Fantastic. But nobody was, so it's this untold story. And one of the reasons that album is so very magical. So, back to Empty Sky. Very little fanfare. Skyline Pigeon's on it. It's a shitty recording of Skyline Pigeon. It's a harpsichord and stuff. He later did a B-side for, I think, Daniel in 72 or 73, where he re-recorded it in a more traditional Elton John style. That's very good. So I recommend listening to that too, if you like Skyline Pigeon and you haven't heard it. It didn't do well, and they decided, let's try again. Let's do another Elton John album. This time, get a proper producer, because the guy who produced Empty Sky was Steve Brown, who was like a publisher guy. He wasn't, he was a music dude, but he wasn't like a producer's producer. So for the next album, they went out and they got Gus Dudgeon, who became the producer of all of Elton John's classic 70s albums, from the Elton John album to Rock of the Westies. And then Elton John got on drugs and started hiring different producers. So we'll get to that. But for now, we got Gus Dudgeon producing an album which will be called the Elton John album. Well, it's called Elton John, but referred to as the Elton John album. Black cover, Elton John's face, shadowy silhouettes, and a lush orchestra. And it's a mellow album. It's a singer-songwriter-ish sounding album. It's got a couple of upbeat tunes. It's got Take Me to the Pilot. It's got The Cage. And then it's got a lot of orchestra stuff. Things that have become classics to Elton John fans over the years. But at the time, nothing was really hit material except Your Song. So Your Song was on that album. Now, Your Song was released in the USA. But not until Elton John and drummer Nigel Olsson and bass player Dee Murray were flown over to America to play sets at Doug Weston's Troubadour in Los Angeles. So how this went down was there was a guy named Russ Regan who was part of the American leg of the record company that had done Empty Sky. And he had heard Empty Sky, didn't like it, didn't release it in the U.S. When he heard the Elton John album, fucking freaked out and got people on the phone and started making shit happen. There was another guy named Howard Rose who had the same reaction, who was managed all kinds of big-name musicians. So Long story short, they arranged for Elton John to come to America and perform at Doug Weston's Troubadour with Nigel Olsson, with Dee Murray, and these guys, Regan and Rose and others, packed the place with big name artists. Gordon Lightfoot was there, Leon Russell was there, Mike Love was there. They had Neil Diamond introduce Elton John to the world. So the first time Elton John stepped onto an American stage, it was the Troubadour in Los Angeles, and he was introduced by Neil Diamond. Now, at this point, Your Song, not a hit. The album had just been released, not a hit. So his name was out there, but he wasn't coming in to support, oh, I've got this big hot shit single. He was just coming over here to play and impress. And he did. But before we get to that, there's a story that Bernie Taupin and Elton John, to go back, they obsessed with American music. And you can hear it all over their early stuff and throughout their career. I mean, if you listen to Tumbleweed Connection, this is like an album with an Old West feel and all of these references to the Civil War and all these country, Southern type themes and melodies and words. All of those songs were written before Bernie Taupin had even seen America. This was the English kid's cinematic dream of what America was. And Elton John had the same type of sentiments musically from listening to Elvis and Leon Russell and all these different American artists. So they were obsessed with America. So coming over, they couldn't wait to taste the Americana. And as soon as they get off the plane, the record company had arranged for a fucking English double-decker red bus to come pick them up as like a publicity gimmick. And they were so disappointed because they wanted to get an American car and all this stuff. And then here they are touted around in this English promotional vehicle. But I'm sure they got over that pretty quickly, because when they hit the stage at the Troubadour, Elton John did open with Your Song by himself, no band. But then when Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson came on, they played, from every account that has been told, one of the craziest, high-powered, wall of sound, energetic performances that rock and roll history has seen. I mean, it is one of the most seminal concerts that's ever taken place in rock and roll. They also played there for several nights, but that first night was the night. That is the night that Elton John became famous. It wasn't from Your Song. It wasn't from the Elton John album. It wasn't from, whatever else that happened down the line, Rocket Man or anything. It was because of that. Because the other thing that happened as a direct result of that show was that Robert Hilburn from the Los Angeles Times wrote a praise piece that had no bounds in terms of its celebration of what Elton John and his band had accomplished that night on stage. It started with the word rejoice. And it went on and on about how great he was and how he was going to be around forever and he was the new thing. And he was. And shortly thereafter, Your Song became popular. By the way, Your Song, actually B-side to Take Me to the Pilot, which was supposed to be the single. But all the DJs decided that they liked Your Song better, so they flipped over the record. They all played Your Song, and Your Song was the big hit. Now, here's something else that's interesting about Elton John, because we think of him as a hooksmith, a hitsmith, writing all these hits and singles. What's very interesting is that when you go through the first few albums, Elton John, Tumbleweed Connection, Madman Across the Water, there very little singles released from any of that. Well, you look at Leave On, which is a standard. Tiny Dancer is he's known. That's one of the top songs that Elton John's known for. Not a single. Leave On, not a single. Border Song was a single. Your Song was a single, and they did very well. But the production of albums in this short period of time, 1970 to 71, 4 albums. Elton John, Tumbleweed Connection, Madman Across the Water. Then there was a live album called 11/17/70, which I should mention because it was similar in set and certainly it was the same band as the Troubadour shows. 11/17/70 is a great album and a great document of what those guys were able to do with nothing but piano, bass, and drums. Dee Murray, one of the most underrated bass players that rock and roll has ever seen, and most people who know him and are familiar with, who look a little deeper into the music know that. He's a musician's musician type of thing. But the way he was able to fill up the sound under the piano and the drums, it sounded like a full band. It was amazing. And him and Nigel Olsson sang backups. It's crazy, but the one downfall, I think, of 11-17-70, from what I have read over the years, from people that were at the Troubadour show, is that they say 11-17-70 doesn't really capture much of what happened at the Troubadour. Their playing was far more energetic, powerful at the Troubadour, probably because of the atmosphere and the occasion and the audience, than it was on 11-17-70. Again, this is what I've read. I wasn't at either of them, obviously, so I don't know. But the 11-17-70 was recorded in a studio with like 150 people or something like that, so the mood was not quite set for him to deliver the kind of power that he did at the Troubadour. But nonetheless, it's fucking awesome. So if you don't have 11-17-70, please get it, because if nothing else, it is an amazing historical document. And when speaking of his early 70s albums, let's not leave out the soundtrack to the movie Friends. It's a low-budget movie that he did the soundtrack for. Nothing much to glean from it, although the title song Friends is very good. And there's a song called Can I Put You On, which is also quite good, and was played in those early sets. Troubadour, I don't know if it was played at Troubadour. It's definitely played at 11-17-70. So within the span of April to 1970, when the Elton John album was released, until November of 1971, we have 5 albums, counting 11-17-70 and the Friends soundtrack. Now, all of those albums were produced by Gus Dudgeon, and they all featured a variety of different session musicians, orchestras arranged and conducted by the amazing Paul Buckmaster. But after that period, Elton John decided to focus on his actual band, because Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson played sporadically on Tumbleweed and Madman and things like that. So Davy Johnstone, great guitarist, came in for the recording of the song Madman Across the Water from the album the same name. And they kept him on for live performances and then brought him in to do the next album, which was Honky Chateau. Now, Honky Chateau was 1972, followed by Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player in 1973, Yellow Brick Road in 73, Caribou in 74, and then Captain Fantastic in 75. Every one of those albums, as you know, chock full of hits, and all produced by Gus Dudgeon, all using the core band. Some of it with orchestra, some of it without. But that is where Elton John solidified himself as, at the time, maybe the biggest solo pop star in the world. Cover of Time magazine, had his own Hollywood Walk of Fame. They declared Elton John Day in Los Angeles. And it's a period of unmatchable success, really. Yellow Brick Road was one of the greatest selling albums of all time, and then followed by the album Caribou, which, in my mind, it's a good album. It has Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, it has Bitches Back. The album ends with a song called Ticking, which is disturbing as shit. If you haven't heard Ticking, please go listen to Ticking, because Ticking is fucking haunting and dark, and some of the best piano playing that Elton John has ever done on a recorded song. At that point, fever pitch was reached, and that's when they did the Captain Fantastic album. Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy was the first album in history ever to debut at number 1. It happens all the time now because of Amazon pre-sales and shit like that, but back then, if you wanted an album, you had to go get it. And on the day it came out, everyone went to go get it. And it delivered. In my opinion, arguably, it's probably his best album. I did a podcast a year and a half ago, my first episode of Pop Talking Aliens, where I rated all of Elton John's albums. And I took the easy way out and put Yellow Brick Road ahead of Captain Fantastic, only because Yellow Brick Road showcases the diversity of styles that Elton John and Bernie Taupin were able to tackle. And it puts it all in one place, and somehow it maintains a cohesive feel, and it almost feels like a concept album, even though there's like all kinds of different songs going on in there. Captain Fantastic is much more consistent with itself. Obviously, it's telling a story. Again, not a mining ground for singles. I think the only single was Someone Saved My Life Tonight, which is a callback to an event from the early years that we were talking about when Elton John was supposed to get married to this girl, and I guess she was a real bitch, and also he's gay, so he didn't want to go through with it, and I'm laughing because of Elton John laughs at this too. The story is that he put his head in an oven as a cry for help, but he left all the windows open, so you couldn't suffocate from the gas if you had all the windows open and stuff. So Bernie Taupin came and found him and said, "Get the fuck out of the oven." And they went and hung out with Long John Baldry and had some drinks, and they convinced Elton John not to marry this girl. And that was Someone Saved My Life Tonight, one of the classics. Now, at that point, Elton John had reached a pinnacle of fame that he couldn't quite deal with. And, when you get to the number one album debut and you're as famous as you possibly is humanly possible, I think he felt that there was no other way to go but down from that point. So what he did was the reasonable solution of firing everyone in his band, except Davy Johnstone. And he hired a guy named Roger Pope to play drums, who had actually worked, he had actually known back from the Empty Sky days, Caleb Quay on guitar, which he also knew from back then. And he put together this more edgy rock band. And when he went to debut the Captain Fantastic songs live, he had already fired all the guys that actually played on Captain Fantastic. Again, save Davy Johnstone. And they went to Wembley, an outdoor set with the Beach Boys. It was rainy. It was miserable weather. The crowd was sitting there waiting for him to play. He comes on, he's got a new band, and he fucking plays Captain Fantastic in its entirety before playing any hits. A master recording of that show was dug up many years ago and released, along with a remastered version of Captain Fantastic. Pick that up if you don't have it. You got to hear this concert. It's very good, it's very interesting, but it's very different than what the album sounded like, because like Roger Pope is like a fucking maniac on drums, and Nigel Olsson is more smooth. He likes to play behind the beat, breaks things up, it's weird fills all the time. Roger Pope is just like, in your face, brick shit house, going all the time. And so Elton John began his second era, his second chapter, which would prove not to be as fruitful as the first. After the Captain Fantastic concert debacle, because no one was really happy about it, sitting out in the rain listening to a bunch of songs they never heard before, he recorded an album called Rock of the Westies. Gus Dudgeon's still producing, and this album is trying to depart from what he had been doing, I guess, in a way. So it's much more up-tempo. There's a lot more guitar, very, very guitar-oriented. And, some people like it in retrospect. Some people have told me, yeah, I've just grown to appreciate that album after all these years. I still think not so good. It's got its moments. I Feel Like a Bullet in the Gun of Robert Ford is a classic ballad. It's got Island Girl, Grow Some Funk of Your Own. It's not too bad, but it's a far cry from Captain Fantastic. It also debuted at number one, by the way, because Elton John was still top of the heap at that point, but it was far less enjoyed by critics and fans alike. Also, the cover of the album says a lot about what was going on at the time, because Elton John looks fucking disgusting on it. He's wearing this hat, his hair's long. He looks like shit. He looks like he's been on drugs for a long time. And yet he was only starting the drugs at that point. The 1976 77, 78, 79 period, very thin in the output of solid material from Elton John. He followed up, I'll take a step back on that, because he followed up with Rock of the Westies with Blue Moves, which is an underrated album. Double album, it has sort of an echo of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, although not obviously nearly as good as that. But it's a solid album. It's with the Roger Pope band, the new band. And some good lyrics by Taupin. Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word is probably the biggest hit, but there's a lot of unmined and underplayed material from that album, which is worth exploring. Blue Moves has become a sort of delineator in Elton John's discography when people speak of his career output. Anytime over the last, say, 16 years or so, when Elton John makes a really good album, it's always harkens back to, this is his best album since Blue Moves, because everyone wants to completely wash out everything he did in the 80s and 90s, album-wise. I think that's very unfair, and so we'll talk about why I don't think that's an accurate comparison to be constantly making. Although I will say that in the case of 2010's album, The Union, that he did with Leon Russell, that album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard charts in America, which actually was the highest debut he had since Blue Moves. But back to the period of the late 70s. After Blue Moves, we get into some greatest hits releases, and he did a session album, an EP with Tom Bell, who was like a Donna Summer disco guy, and Elton John didn't write a lot of the music and stuff. It's a piece of shit, man. It's so bad. It's got a song called Are You Ready for Love that was later became a hit like 25 years later in England. Probably more for like the irony of it, because it's like this disco song. The EP is not good. It was very hard to find for a long time for good reason. But he also made an album called A Single Man, and at this point, Gus Dudgeon isn't even producing his albums. Gus Dudgeon produced Blue Moves, and then he was out. A Single Man has got session musicians. It's very uneven. Again, there's always moments. There's always moments with Elton John, because he's a good fucking musician and singer and player. That any album you hear, there's going to be, I like that track, I like that one. But the inconsistency that was going on was incredible. And personally, he was falling apart. The drugs were happening. I should mention, actually, I'm sorry to have to go back in time here for 1 year, but just prior to Blue Moves, he did a show where he sold out Dodger Stadium. Dodger Stadium sold out. Only other person that did that, the Beatles. He wore like this sequin Dodger outfit. Billie Jean King came up on stage. Again, the Roger Pope, Caleb Quaye band. And at that time, he was, to people that knew him, already like falling apart with the drugs, and he was bulimic, and so he was just, he was falling apart personally, even though he was at the top playing Dodger Stadium. That was the pinnacle. Now, getting back to what I was talking about, after that, the huge drop-off. No Gus Dudgeon, greatest hits albums, A Single Man. It was also at this point that the record company threw in Empty Sky as an American release to try to make a couple of bucks. A low point. Bernie Taupin even. Bernie Taupin himself kicked to the curb. Now, I don't know, as the stories go, that was specifically just Elton John telling Bernie Taupin to fuck off, or if it was a mutual thing. The way it's described now, it was sort of a mutual, like, Bernie Taupin was like, dude, look, you're making like 5 albums every 5 minutes, and you're on drugs, and I just need to go to Mexico and hang out on the beach. And good for him. So that perpetuated A Single Man and that Tom Bell session stuff. And then, the worst of the worst, Victim of Love. Easily Elton John's worst album. Did not write a song on it. None of his musicians on it. None of his good producers. No Bernie Taupin. And it's all disco. I said this on my previous podcast, but Elton John's Victim of Love album leads off with Johnny Be Good, a disco version of Johnny Be Good. 8 minutes long. 8 minutes of disco Johnny Be Good. The Grateful Dead not known for brevity, recorded theirs in less than 4. So Elton John is doubling up the Grateful Dead on length on Johnny Be Good. Piece of shit and a bad sign for Elton John fans. To add insult to injury, during this dark period, he retired on stage. He was doing a show where he's like drugged up and stuff, and I've heard some of the show, it's awful. And at some point he decides to just announce his retirement on stage. I can't deal with being on the road anymore, and I'm not going to do it, and I retire, and I'm sorry. And then he plays sorry seems to be the hardest word. It's terrible. It's terrible. I personally am so glad that I didn't discover Elton John until the late 80s, so I didn't have to live through this. I could look back on it in retrospect and think it's funny and pathetic and silly and weird, but I didn't have to go through it. 1980 comes. Elton John comes to a little bit of his senses. He starts using Nigel and Dee again, making an album called 21 at 33. This was produced by a guy named Clive Franks, who has worked with Elton John, or had worked with Elton John for many, 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 many years, doing sound and other things for him. And so he co-produced 21 at 33 with Elton John himself in this case. Again, Nigel Olsson, Dee Murray, back in action. Davy Johnstone, he survived all the firings. Always. He was always there. Not on Tom Bell sessions and Victim of Love, because God, no one had anything to do with that other than Elton John. No one pissed on their own credibility outside of Elton John himself with those albums. So Davy Johnstone, scot-free. 21 at 33, what it meant was that he had 21 albums at the age of 33, which is wildly inaccurate, depending on... People have tried to figure out how he got to that number, and I think it has something to do with counting double albums as 2 albums and throwing in some greatest hits. He had a live album in 1976. Maybe that's part of it too. Nobody knows, but that's what it's called. We'll live with that. It had Little Genie. It had, that was it in terms of hits. But it had Two Rooms at the End of the World, which I was talking about, which was the triumphant return of Bernie Taupin writing a lyric for Elton John. Bernie Taupin wrote 3 of the tracks on 21 at 33. And the rest were this guy, Gary Osborne, the great Tom Robinson, who loves our favorite Corner Laughers, the band The Corner Laughers, our dear friends. Tom Osborne, big fan of them. But anyway, he wrote some of the lyrics on 21 at 33. And it's not bad. It's got this sort of southern rock feel to it. This, like, not southern rock, southern LA sound, like an Eagles type of thing. And some of the Eagles actually sang backups on it. So it was better. It was in a better direction. But the cocaine was beginning to infiltrate everything. There's even a fucking song about cocaine on this album called White Lady, White Powder. So now Elton John, with 1980, starts getting back into the factory system of putting out an album every year. And the next album after 21 at 33 was called The Fox. The Fox has always been an album that was hard to find for a long time, now online and stuff. Obviously, it's, you can order it now and get it tomorrow. But for me personally, I searched for that LP forever. And it is an underrated album. A lot of Elton John's stuff from the 1980s gets, in my mind, unfairly maligned because of the fact that he really went pop, and sort of the organic edge of the Tumbleweeds and the Madman Across the Waters and so forth were completely lost in the 80s. And that's deserving of pointing out, and it's certainly not a plus, but there were moments where he was, doing something different, and it actually paid off. One of the moments is on The Fox. There's an instrumental piece called Carla Etude, orchestra arranged by the late, great James Newton Howard. Beautiful piece of music. It's awesome. And there are other songs on that album that are quite good. The Fox, the title track, a Taupin lyric. There's a few Taupin lyrics here. Again, Gary Osborne in there, and the great Tom Robinson, who wrote a song called Elton Song on that album, which is, in my opinion, the best Elton John song that does not have Bernie Taupin lyrics. It's Tom Robinson, and it's wonderful. And now, with 1982, let's look at this era as 1982 to 1986. All right? The pop, coke, 80s era. 1982, we got Jump Up, which this one had the band and a bunch of Taupin lyrics. What was a hit? Blue Eyes? Blue Eyes was a hit from that album. By the way, I named the hits because Elton John had, I think probably still has, the all-time record of having a top 40 hit in the charts every year from 1970 to 1999. So even when his career was in this, 80s limbo, and he didn't have the respect and cachet that he had in the early 70s, every year he still had a hit. Despite the coke, the pot, the bulimia, the promiscuous gay sex that was happening all the time, and I don't say that in jest, that is true. He has many, many, many times said that it's not almost physically impossible that he escaped that period of time without getting AIDS. Jump Up followed by what I consider to be his second best 80s album, which was Too Low for Zero. You got I'm Still Standing. You got, I guess that's why they call it the blues. He was writing good music. These albums, I should say, The Fox, Jump Up, Too Low for Zero, were all produced by Chris Thomas. Chris Thomas was a guy with some credibility. He was he was one of the engineers on Dark Side of the Moon. But his sort of take on Elton John's music was to 80s it up. So there's always like extra synthesizers for no reason. There's chorusing on the bass that you don't need. Dee Murray doesn't need fucking gimmicks on his bass. So even songs that if you listen to and think, if you broke this down, this is a pretty good rock song, they sound like 80s pop songs. Sometimes that was good, and I'm Still Standing, I guess that's why they call it the blues. Other times, decent songs ruined, and bad songs made even worse. So Too Low for Zero was sold very well, pumped out hits. Elton John toured with it. He toured with everything, basically. Elton John has been on the road basically his whole life. That late 70s era that we talked about, not so much. He did do a tour in Russia in 79 with Ray Cooper, which was very cool. First Western artist to play in Russia. Billy Joel will have you believe it was him. It was fucking not him. Billy Joel was the first American to play in Russia, which is no small feat, and Billy Joel deserves a lot of credit for it. But Billy Joel also tries to portray the fact that he was the first person from any non-Eastern, East European country to play in Russia. It's not true. I don't mean to get on Billy Joel. I love Billy Joel. I'm just saying. Elton John in Russia in 1979. That was really the only thing of musical note or musically challenging that he did in that time. But back to the 80s that we're talking about, he was touring for every album. And the interesting thing is that with every tour, the songs got faster, they got more raucous, and they were clearly fueled by cocaine. After 1983's Too Low for Zero, he released Breaking Hearts. Breaking Hearts, of course, with the sad song Say So Much, is the big smash hit from that album. And again, an album with some very good moments. The song Breaking Hearts itself is heartbreaking. It's beautiful. Slow Down Georgie, She's Poison. Who Wears These Shoes? It's a great pop album. It's a good, a very solid pop album, if you will. And he toured for that album in 1984, wearing one of those straw boater hats, like a red-tailed suit jacket, I think in some cases a bow tie. And there is a performance that is worth watching from that era. It's live at Wembley Stadium in 1984, the outdoor stadium. When I was younger, before you could YouTube everything up, you had to buy VHSs of these shows, and you could, every once in a while he'd release a VHS, so there wasn't a lot of documentation of his live playing. But he released 2 videos of this show. One was called Breaking Hearts Tour, and then later on they released a second VHS called The Nighttime Concert, trying to pawn it off as a different show. It wasn't. It was just the later half of this same Wembley show in 1984. But this video is, to me, the ultimate documentation of Elton John's cocaine-fueled pop sensibilities of the 80s. If you watch some of this show, he is so fucking coked out of his mind. He's pulling on his nose all the time. He's sweating like a pig, bathed in sweat. Nigel Olsson is wearing like a racing suit. He's playing like a runaway train. Dee Murray's playing one of those electric basses that doesn't have like the tuning thing on the end. It's just cut off. And he's got like a flange sound on his bass. They've all got mullets. Davy Johnstone's got 6 layers of tan, and they are playing these songs so fucking fast. Elton John is running around stage. He's jumping away from the piano at every given opportunity because he simply can't control himself because he's so coked up. And it is a blast. And what's best about it, well, not what's best about it, but something that adds to the allure of this, is that if you have the original cassette, which I still do, transferred to DVD, of the Breaking Hearts Tour video, in the beginning, they show him introducing the video in a room, and he's got these dark sunglasses on. He's wearing like a fucking safari hat, and he's retiring to you as the intro to this video. Saying, I've been on the road and I'm not going to be going on the road anymore. So I hope you enjoy this last concert that I will ever play at the Wembley Stadium, Breaking Hearts Tour 1984. Sure enough, a few months later, he's back in the studio recording another album, and he's back on the road supporting it. That album, Ice on Fire. Now this, we come into a low point once again. Nikita's on this album, which is a great pop song to me, but it is one of the laziest, overproduced, oversynthesized albums that it's borderline unlistenable to me. But strangely, he rehired Gus Dudgeon to produce Ice on Fire and fired, once again, Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson. Again, Davy Johnstone survives. So now he's going back to Gus Dudgeon for, you would think maybe to recapture some of the feel of his older albums, but no, Gus Dudgeon, and inexplicably on his part, took Elton way further into the Chris Thomas direction. It's like Gus Dudgeon looked at it as some sort of personal challenge from Chris Thomas that, however many synths you can put in an album, I can do you better. So this album is bathed in synthesizers. And again, obviously he did not retire from touring, except for that 5 minutes that he was wearing the safari hat on the video. He went on tour to support Ice on Fire. And it was a great tour, actually. It was Charlie Morgan was playing the drums, who my second favorite Elton John drummer. Definitely Nigel Olsson's, takes number one with a bullet. Can never be replaced. Solid, Hall of Fame. Never to be challenged there. But Charlie Morgan was a good drummer for Elton John. Very solid. I talk about the drummers a lot more than I go into the other musicians as much, because I think that Elton John's music, starting with the Troubadour shows, has always held drums in a very prominent place in his music. There's lots of rock bands where the drummer maybe is just, he's got to be solid. He's there. He can do some tricks, wow you once in a while. Nigel Olsson doesn't do a lot of the wowing, and Charlie Morgan didn't either, although Nigel Olsson can certainly give you a crazy-ass awesome fill when he wants to. Charlie Morgan didn't do that kind of thing at all, but he was rock solid, and he played perfectly into Elton John's music because I mention it because Elton John's piano playing is very percussive. It's not melodic for the most part. He has smaller hands. He plays very, very hard. Bruce Hornsby tells a story of Elton John breaking a piano string. That is almost physically impossible. It can be done, but I mean, you have to be pounding the shit out of that thing in order to make that happen. Jimmy Iovine, the great producer, produced a song that Elton John did with John Lennon in the early 70s called Whatever Gets You Through the Night. And Iovine tells the story of he hadn't ever recorded a piano before on a record. And so he kind of just figured it out before Elton John and John Lennon got in there by putting some mics, here and there in the room, and he wasn't really sure what he was doing. And he said Elton John comes in and he starts playing so fucking loud that move the mics further apart, basically just capturing the sound of the room. And Elton John's playing so loud that the microphones sound like they're right up against the piano. And they had to use, when Gus Dudgeon was producing him in Yellow Brick Road, they used to use different techniques also to sort of try and contain how loud he played. One of them, which I think is awesome, is for Yellow Brick Road and I think for Caribou, maybe other albums, they got another piano that was the same size as the piano that Elton John was playing on, hollowed it out, so it was just the shell, and hung it upside down over Elton John's piano on basically like a suspension wires so that they could lower it and raise it depending on how hard he was playing for any particular song, so that they could consistently capture the sound and not have it be all, one song is just too loud, one song is quiet. So they were able to do basically like a manual compression on his piano by doing that. So anyway, I got to that point by talking about his drummers. And Charlie Morgan is now his drummer for the Ice on Fire tour. A couple of other guys. Pino Palladino on bass, who's one of the, session musician extraordinaire. He's played with John Mayer and fucking God knows who else, you name him. He's crossed their paths. There were like a billion musicians that played a trumpet here, a sax there, a bass line here, some backup vocals here. George Michael sings backup vocals. It's this huge thing, and he moved that sort of bigger sound into his tour. And this tour carried him through into the recording of his next album, which was Leather Jackets. Along with Victim of Love, you can throw Leather Jackets into the piss pool of god-awful albums. Once again produced by Gus Dudgeon, overproduced by Gus Dudgeon, even more, possibly more session musicians than Ice on Fire. Leather Jackets is garbage. It should just be called Cocaine, and it should just be Elton John snorting cocaine. It would have been better. It would have been better. The thing it did do, though, is the Ice on Fire tour continued throughout the Leather Jackets recording, and the Ice on Fire tour sort of melded into what would be called the Tour de Force. Now, this is where this era of 1980 to 1986 or so, 1982 to 1986, comes to a head. Elton John had smoked pot all the time. He did coke. He was throwing up all the time for bulimia. And as you can imagine, that kind of shit, plus being on tour all the time, will fuck your voice up really bad. And it did. He developed nodes on his throat, which can do a number of different things. His were benign, so he ultimately had them removed, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what they did in his case was they took out his falsetto range. So all those early songs where he relied on falsetto to create these amazing hooks, like Tiny Dancer and Rocket Man and Daniel, and a ton of songs where you reach the apex of the hook is him singing in falsetto. So as this Ice on Fire / tour de force for Leather Jackets is going on, his voice is decaying almost gig by gig, and he's having trouble hitting the notes. I know a lunatic Elton John fan who has somehow bootlegs of like all these shows, and he sent me clips just to sort of listen to the degradation of Elton John's voice, and there's a couple of times near the end of the tour where he tries, man, to hit high notes in Rocket Man, and it just cracks, and it sounds awful, and you can feel the frustration. But to end this tour de force, is what he was calling it, basically Leather Jackets tour, he toured Australia with the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And it was going to culminate with a video, a satellite broadcast, and an album where he would feature the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra live, produced by Gus Dudgeon, and he did not want to cancel it. So he pushed through the rest of this Australia tour without being able to sing high notes, having the backup singers cover for him as much as possible, his voice sounding like a rock quarry being emptied, but he did it anyway. And the Live in Australia album that he was able to produce, to me, is amazing. And much like 11-17-70, it has its flaws, but it is absolutely worth having. The orchestra is amazing. Gus Dudgeon did an incredible job of individually miking violins and horns and flutes. It's beautiful, and it covers all of that orchestral stuff that he recorded in the early days, the Paul Buckmaster arrangements. James Newton Howard conducted the orchestra on the Live in Australia album. But it's an amazing demonstration of someone who loves music so much, who loves playing so much, that he was like, I am not going to fucking quit this tour. I will get these things taken out of my throat as soon as this is done. But first, Live in Australia. The other reason is that he didn't know if he'd be able to sing again after that. When you get nodes removed, you're gambling. I mean, some singers just keep them. But with him, they were pretty severe because, again, all the singing, all the coke, all the pot, all the throwing up, all the drinking, alcohol will fuck up your throat also. So in order for him to even have a chance at continuing a career, he had to have the surgery. When, again, like I was saying, a lot of singers just leave them and they just sort of alter the way they sing, and they don't sing as much, and they do teas and honeys and different herbal things, and they can get by. But it wasn't going to work for him because his voice sounded like shit. And not only was Live in Australia an orchestral recording, he did an entire set beforehand, which was made available on a long-form video of Live in Australia, where he didn't have the orchestra. He just had but he still had this huge band. He had a horn section. He had Ray Cooper on percussion. He had some other girl on percussion, 2 guitarists, synthesizer, Charlie Morgan in there, David Payton playing the bass in this case. Hugely long set with that, and then comes out the orchestra. So that's one of my favorite moments in Elton John history. And it caps off sort of the 80s Coke era, culminating with him returning to his roots a bit, doing Live in Australia, and then gambling with the surgery. And thankfully, the surgery went very well. He recovered his voice after that. He didn't do much in 1987 because he had to recover. When he did recover, his voice did not have the falsetto back completely. There was a little bit of it, but he didn't take risks on trying to hit notes in Rocket Man and stuff. So any recording of Rocket Man that you ever hear live from 1985 on, no high notes. Daniel, same thing. Tiny Dancer, same thing. All of those falsetto hooks gone from the live performance. So you might ask, well, if he wasn't doing anything in 1987, how did he keep up this supposed top 40 hit string that you bragged about earlier in the show? He did it with, I think, a song called Flames of Paradise with a girl named Jennifer Rush. It was a duet. I think that's how he cheated his way through the 1987 period. And then there was the Candle in the Wind live recording, which I believe charted as well. So, yeah, that part taken care of. He's done his throat surgery. He's getting back. Then 1988, 1989, those 2 years I like to call the mini comeback. Comeback not in the sense of him being famous again, because he was kind of just chugging along with his 80s stuff. But in 88, with the recovered voice, he released Reg Strikes Back. And Reg Strikes Back had the song I Don't Want to Go On With You Like That, which was a huge hit. And Reg Strikes Back is a weird album. It's like some sort of it's again, he brought back Chris Thomas to produce instead of Gus Dudgeon, and it's this sort of Beach Boys tinged, poppy, weird synth-based album. And it's got its moments, like like most of them do, but not many. Not many. There's a song on there called "Poor Cow," which is fucking disgusting in terms of musicality and lyrics. It's disgusting. But again, Bernie Taupin now was writing all of the lyrics again. On Ice on Fire, on Leather Jackets, as mentioned, it was him and other people. He would be in there sporadically, but with Red Strikes Back, he was writing all of the lyrics. And he decided, Bernie Taupin, to go do a solo album at that time as well. He had done a couple of solo albums earlier in the career, but they were just like in the early 70s. One of them was like him reading poetry, and the other one was him singing a few songs, but nothing really of note. But in 1988, he made a full-on pop album called Tribe. He wrote the lyrics, and Martin Page wrote the music. If you're familiar with Martin Page, him and Bernie Taupin actually wrote These Dreams for Heart. That was a big hit. And they were both also part of the think tank of a gaggle of different songwriters that wrote We Built This City on Rock and Roll. There have been entire magazine articles that delve into all of the people that had a hand in We Built the City and what they did and why it's such a terrible pop song. To me, whatever. I mean, it's not good, but I never had a problem with it. When it was out, it was on the radio, I was fine with it. I didn't know Bernie Taupin had anything to do with it. Didn't care. And Bernie Taupin, when asked about that song, is very quick to distance himself from it and talks about how when it started, it was supposed to be a gritty song about, the music scene in LA and how it kind of eats you up and spits you out. And obviously it turned into some anthem with a radio DJ talking in the middle of the instrumental part. Anyway, 1988, he recorded this album, Tribe, with Martin Page. And if you ever want an example of someone being propped up as a pop star who isn't, Tribe is the ultimate example. The lyrics, for the most part, there's a couple of good ones on there. There's a song called Desperation Train, which is quite good. But the rest of it is it's like Bernie Taupin went into his drawer and pulled out all the cocktail napkins that had scribbled unused ideas on them and taped them together and turned them into songs. There's one song where he's a cop. It's called, I forget what it's called, You Can't Hold Back the Night or something, and he talks about his guilt about arresting people and how he wears this badge to protect and serve, and he drinks all the time because he can't deal with the stress of being a cop. Jesus Christ. So, Bernie Taupin widely rejects that album and basically has distanced himself from it as far as humanly possible over the years. But I don't know. If you're ever on YouTube and you're just doing a rabbit hole thing and you're looking at some Bernie Taupin stuff, check out a couple of tracks from Tribe and see how far you can get. I challenge you. See if you can get through all of Hold Back the Night or Corrugated Iron, where he's pretending that he's a miner or something. Anyway, so Elton John did Red Strikes Back. I don't want to go on with you like that. It was good. And it was at a point where he was 42 years old, midlife crisis, and he's trying to start over in a way. He's trying to wipe the slate clean and have a new beginning. And it's evidenced by the cover of Red Strikes Back, which is all of his lavish clothing that he used to wear. He came on stage in 1980 at Central Park dressed as Donald Duck. He did a show where he was dressed as Tina Turner, with a wig and short-cut jean shorts and, all that weird stuff. In the beginning, it was cute and funny during the 70s, and then it just became self-parody. So he realizes this, and the cover of Red Strikes Back is graced with all of these outfits, and he's wearing just black, and it's the declaration of the fact that he's not going to do that anymore. Now, he's still working with his voice. He's still, testing the waters with what he can do. So he did a short little European tour. replacing now on stage his piano with a keyboard, Roland keyboard. So traditionally, through all of the years, Elton John would have a piano on stage left, and it, would go across the stage horizontally. When he did this keyboard tour, it had a full band, but when he started using a keyboard, he was facing out to the audience with this platform, which was cool, I guess, but also you couldn't see anything he was playing. So that was a drawback, and it didn't sound as good because in 1989, even with the top flight keyboard that he was using this hot shit Roland. It still sounded like a fucking keyboard. And then he went into the studio to record Sleeping with the Past, which I think is a great album. I put it up there with, the better Elton John albums. Sacrifice, Healing Hands, Blue Avenue. They're amazing songs. There's really not a bad song on that album. It's very cohesive. It was his and Bernie Taupin's sort of attempt to capture some of the soul influences that they, R&B and soul influences that they had when they were younger. And it kind of does, but it's unfortunately produced by Chris Thomas. So there's no horns, there's synth horns, and aspects like that, unfortunately, keep it from really nailing it. But the song quality is great. His voice sounds amazing. And personally, Sacrifice to me, arguably my most favorite Elton John song. And the other thing is, on this album, he used an R&B type band, African American singers, black rhythm section, Romeo Williams on bass, who was a real slap bass, soulful, funky bass player. Davy Johnstone's still alive, still in there. And the drummer was Jonathan Philip Moffett, who was a human drum machine. He played for Madonna, Michael Jackson, things like that. He is rock steady, solid. You could set every metronome in the world to this guy. And his ability to play one bass drum with one foot and make it sound like two is commendable and very amazing. The problem is he took that same band out on tour for Sleeping with the Past. And when they played the Sleeping with the Past songs and some of the 80s pop songs, that kind of drumming really, really drove it, and it was great. But when he went into Burn Down the Mission or Love Lies Bleeding or Tiny Dancer, you don't want to hear those songs with a human metronome guy who plays basically human drum machine. Love Lies Bleeding on the 1989 Elton John World Tour is bizarre. I don't want to say it's bad, but it's bizarre hearing it played with a drummer like that and a bass player like that. It's very, very odd. But the coke, the drugs, all of that was still going on at this point. It was coming to a head, and he was about to, thankfully, get sober. And I'll tell you a quick story about what I understand were the myriad temper tantrums that he was throwing back then. The first concert I ever went to was 1989 for this tour at Shoreline Amphitheater in Mountain View. And the show was supposed to start at 8, no opening act. The stage is set up. You can look down there, and he had this sort of 80s platform set up on stage where drummer was on one platform, backup singers on another platform, and then his keyboard was encased in this, I don't know, something that looked like he was between two airplane wings. Odd. But it was all set up there, and at least an hour and 15 minutes went by. Nothing. It's dark outside now, and the rumblings start to begin. Is this show going to be canceled? What the fuck is happening? Right about that time, a helicopter flies directly over Shoreline Amphitheater. 5 minutes later, he's on stage. And he played a great set, and particularly for me, because I'd never seen him before and I idolized him so much, it was an amazing set. But he was very disengaged, did not talk to the audience a lot, was sort of in his own world. He complained about the acoustics at Shoreline at one point. And, I mean, I guess he was probably phoning it in, but the thing is that he's so good. Even when he was phoning it in, it was still awesome. And I've gone back and listened to bootlegs of that show, and it still sounds great. But when I think about it in retrospect, he really wasn't there, if you know what I'm saying. So, only a few months later, he kind of went into exile, and he got sober. And he came back with The One. And that begins the era of the real comeback. The One was a huge hit. It put him back on the map as now not someone who was, a 70s hitsmith who was trying to stay relevant with all these hits through the 80s and doing coke and sweating like a pig on stage, but instead sort of returning to just being a songwriter and pop star that was extremely well respected by his peers. I think one of the culminations, one of the big milestones in that time period was he did November Rain with Guns N' Roses at the 1992 MTV Music Awards. And this was during the days where the MTV Music Awards was like, the thing. If you were on that, you were in. And so he did The One on that show, and he did November Rain with Guns N' Roses. And for me, being in high school, being an Elton John fan in the 90s, not easy until that moment. And then everyone, oh my God, Bill, I saw Elton John on The Thing. I understand why you like him so much. He's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So 1992 comes around and he does this great world tour. The life was back in him. So engaged. I saw him in 92 at Bridge School Benefit in Mountain View where he did acoustic set with Neil Young. And in Oakland where he played full set with a full band. Charlie Morgan back on drums now. He didn't do that whole rhythm and blues thing. Davy Johnstone is still there, of course. Dee Murray, at this point, having been fired 2 to 3 times, sadly passed away. So the opportunity for Dee Murray to come back was null and void. And I should say that Chris Thomas produced The One, so it's very uneven. There's a lot of drum machine on it. The One itself is an amazing song, but there's lots of songs on there where it's just, it's obviously not a piano. It's obviously a drum machine or a guy playing drums like a drum machine. I think the guy's name was Ollie Romo who played on that. Pino Palladino played the bass on that album. There is one song where David Gilmour plays a guitar solo, which is awesome. And there's a duet with Eric Clapton called Runaway Train, which is also quite good. Also because Bernie Taupin wrote a great lyric about, Clapton had his tragedy with his son. Elton John was coming through sobriety. So it's a nice redemption song, revitalization themes, and quite good. And Bernie Taupin was now back in form also, I think, with the lyrics to The One. It's a lot of really good stuff there lyrically. So you had the MTV Music Awards, great tour, 1992. 93 was a bit of a letdown. He did a duets album, which is, to me, just any time, unless you're Frank Sinatra, duets albums are a no-go for me. Also, the selection of people that he did duets with the exception of a Leonard Cohen duet of a Ray Charles song. It was Katie Lang. It was PM Dawn. Do you remember them? It was Marcella Detroit from Shakespeare's Sisters, like one-hit wonder after one-hit wonder. 1994, we see The Lion King, his first venture into writing musicals. That created a whole new audience for him. Can You Feel the Love Tonight, Circle of Life, huge hits. Lightweight pop, not my favorite songs that ever lived, but absolutely, definitely, he had put himself into a place of rock and roll pop star, elder statesman. And in 94, still 94, he started writing the album Made in England. His first real return to form. I mean, The One was okay, but the Made in England, he went back to Paul Buckmaster strings. The material from Taupin, lyrically, the songs from Taupin are amazing through and through on Made in England. Huge orchestra, no drum machines, synthesizers at a very minimum, and when they're used very tastefully. One of the songs is produced by George Martin of legendary Beatles fame with, all of the signature George Martin French horns and so forth. Very good album. Very good album, and severely underrated, in my opinion. You never hear about Made in England when you hear about later era Elton John albums that are good. Made in England is always kind of skipped. And the reason is, I think, because shortly thereafter, Princess Diana passed away, and Elton John did the re-recording of Candle in the Wind with new Bernie Taupin lyrics about Princess Diana, which was the biggest selling single of all time. What he tried to do at that point also was piggyback that single on a new album that he just recorded, again with Chris Thomas, called The Big Picture. And the fact that The Big Picture followed Made in England is borderline tragic, because The Big Picture harkens back to the worst of his Chris Thomas era songwriting and production. Synthesizers aplenty, easy listening, and not good easy listening songs. I think the hit he had from that was called Something About the Way You Look Tonight, which is, it's good. It's got a nice little hook and everything, but it's about as pedestrian as you can get in terms of, Elton John can write a song like that in his sleep. So it was a bit disappointing. But he did a great tour for The Big Picture, back to the piano, Charlie Morgan on drums, Davy Johnstone. At this point, he had also solidified a band that he'd had for a while with a bass player named Bob Birch, synthesizer guy named Guy Babylon, who was amazing. And his ability to duplicate the sounds from the original albums added a ton to this tour and also the 92 tour, because previous to that, in the 80s, when he would have a synth player, the synth player was just kind of making shit up, playing weird patches, weird sounds on the keyboard, and nothing that was consistent with what was on the album. He was just like throwing in shit all over the place, and it never really worked. So Guy Babylon took the approach of, let's try to simulate what's on the record, and he was amazing at sampling, and he was amazing at playing. So the music started to sound like the music should on the Big Picture tour. So the Big Picture itself as an album, piece of shit. The resulting tour, quite good. After that, Elton John went and wrote the musical Aida with Tim Rice, who he also wrote The Lion King with. And that was a huge success on Broadway and full of good songs. But he got to the point, and this is the end of yet another era that sort of starts with The One and ends up here in 1999 with Aida. After that point, he decided, and now, he's been sober for 10 years, so he's kind of locked into that lifestyle. He decided to make an album. He heard the Ryan Adams album, Heartbreaker, and it made him decide he wanted to write an album that wasn't geared towards hits. Strip it down, go back to the old ways, and the result was, in my mind, his best album since Sleeping with the Past, and probably his other than Sleeping with the Past, probably since Blue Moves, like I indicated earlier, that always the since Blue Moves comparison. This one earned it. And not only that, but Nigel Olsson returned. After having been fired 3 times, Nigel Olsson was back on board. And you know what's awesome? Nigel Olsson stayed from Songs from the West Coast until this very day. If you go see Elton John at a concert right now, you will see Nigel Olsson. Davy Johnstone, of course, always survived. Always survived. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. There were also a bevy of session musicians on Songs from the West Coast, but it's very consistent. The songs are terrific. I Want Love was the big hit from that. If you remember the video with Robert Downey Jr. walking around lip-syncing, This Train Don't Stop There Anymore had a video with Justin Timberlake lip-syncing, because at this point Elton John didn't want to be in his own videos. Yeah. You can understand. It's not like he looks like Justin Timberlake or something. So, put good-looking people in there, and then people will hear the song, and they won't have to look at you, and that's not a bad promotional strategy right there. He followed up Songs from the West Coast with an amazing tour. Fantastic tour, and he also, for the first time in many, many, many years, started really delving into the deep cuts of his earlier albums. So he was playing stuff like Dixie Lily, Come Down in Time, Country Comfort, Gotta Get a Meal Ticket, really giving the true fans something special rather than just carting out Philadelphia Freedom. Guess that's why they call it the blues. I'm Still Standing, Sad Songs Say So Much, and so blah, 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 blah. No, he really went for it. And it was an amazing tour and really marked what I call the final era, the era that goes from 2001 to today. It also began his own version of the Never-Ending Tour. He has really not taken a break from touring since that Songs from the West Coast. He changes it up. He changes the name. He started playing regular residencies in Vegas, which he still does, but constant touring. I mean, if you could look at his tour schedule today and you'd be like, what the fuck? He's still out there playing 150 shows a year, minimum, at 3 hours a pop, 27 songs, still doing it at 70. So back to what he was doing album-wise. In 2004, he tried to go with a similar feel to Songs from the West Coast, but make it a little more rustic, called Peachtree Road. Again, very organic, not a lot of synthesizers. This one was produced by him himself, Elton John himself. Sadly, it missed the mark, although you can tell what he was trying to do. He was doing this southern thing. He had a home in Atlanta at the time, and I think at this point he was married to longtime partner David Furnish, so, new lease on life, very happy, a very positive album, which always lends a problem to an Elton John album when he tries to go super, super happy. So Bernie Taupin is not at his best when he's writing happy. Bernie Taupin, Songs from the West Coast is a great example. Songs from the West Coast is an album lyrically from a man in conflict. Bernie Taupin had just gotten divorced, and the songs are reflective of that. There's depth. There's a lot of depth to the lyrics on Songs from the West Coast. Peachtree Road, he's trying to satisfy Elton John's need to declare his, new lease on life, his long-term sobriety and all of that. And it was a nice try. Good effort. It wasn't like the Big Picture where you can tell they might as well have done it by phone. He was in there on it, Peachtree Road, got his hands dirty, but came up snake eyes. A solid tour followed, which was basically just a continuation of what he had been doing since 2001 with the Songs from West Coast tour. After he did another tour in 2002, he did a solo tour in 2003 where he just did songs on piano. Then 2004 with Peachtree Road, he launched another full-blown tour that went on and on forever until 2006 when, and I touched on this album earlier, they did the sequel to Captain Fantastic, Captain and the Kid. So Captain Fantastic went up to 1969. Captain and the Kid goes from 70 to, I guess, 2006. There's a lot to cram into that. There's a song that's just about him doing coke. It's a good song. It's weird. It's called And the House Fell Down. The lyrics are hardcore. He talks about smoking joints and doing blow and all this stuff. But the music, if you read the lyrics, you'd think that it would be this really sort of strung out ballad with empty, reverberated, sparse guitars and things like that. But instead, Elton John spun it on its head and he wrote it as this sort of manic dance hall number that is more reflective of, musically of cocaine itself. So to me, it's brilliant. It's not a great song, but the execution of it is brilliant. But there are some really good songs on Captain and the Kid. Old 67, which is about how Elton John and Bernie Taupin don't really hang out much. They do their writing remotely, but it's a song about some times that they got together and would hang out in France and reminisce about the old days. And then the closing track, the title track, Captain and the Kid, harkens back to Captain Fantastic melodically. It has the riff from the original Captain Fantastic. And it's a song about looking forward and the, signs on the road and, looking back while you're looking forward. And it's good stuff. But you can't replicate the magic of Captain Fantastic. You can't even come close. And I don't know that they were trying to do that. But again, there's good songs on it. There's good moments on it. It does have a very cohesive feel. It's written in order. Starts off with a reference to that big red English bus that picked him up at the airport, and of course ends with them trottling down the yellow brick road together after so many years. So, yeah, there you go. And that continued the tour that never ends. Vegas, solo tours, a little bit of Ray Cooper. He did a lot of stuff with Billy Joel sporadically during the late 90s and up until, I think, around this point in 2006. But Billy Joel's a man with issues. And, Billy Joel hasn't done an album since 1993. Just decided, fuck it. Nobody listens to the new music. Nobody needs another Billy Joel album. And said it was going to be his last album. And unlike Elton John, who retired every 5 minutes and came back 5 minutes later, Billy Joel stuck to his guns on that. He has not released an album since. He did an album of classical piano where he wrote up some classical stuff and had this classical piano genius play it. It's quite good, but There's no shortage of great classical piano music that you should mine long before you get to the Billy Joel album. And so Billy Joel was canceling gigs with Elton John and wasn't showing up. There was one occasion where Billy Joel just didn't show up for a gig, so Elton John played a bunch of his set, added a bunch of his own songs, and then played a bunch of Billy Joel songs that he doesn't normally play. He played like 3.5 hours, part of it with Billy Joel's band, part of it with his own band, because by the time Billy Joel didn't show up, the audience was there. The show was ready to go. So it wasn't like you can't just say, oh, I'm sorry, you got to leave and we'll give you new tickets. So he delivered for them, and that was awesome. And back to 2006, after Captain and the Kid, Elton attempted to write a Broadway musical, this time with Bernie Taupin. Usually he'd written with Tim Rice. And it was about the vampire Lestat, the Anne Rice novels. And I actually got to see a preview of this play in San Francisco. And I thought the music was quite good. The lyrics were fantastic. But it was ballad after ballad after ballad after ballad. And the show went from San Francisco to, I think, another city to tour. And they tweaked it and they tweaked it and they tweaked it. And it got to Broadway. And it lasted like no days, and it was over. I remember I actually went to New York in 2006, and I remember walking past the sad theater on Broadway that was full of signs that said, Lestat's run has been canceled. If you have tickets, please call this number for a refund. So that was a failure. And after all that, from 2007 to 2009, it was just touring, charity work, the Elton John AIDS Foundation, which has raised millions and millions, one of the highly respected AIDS charities on earth. But nothing in terms of a new album until 2010, when he decided, apparently he was on vacation with his husband, and he was listening to Leon Russell while he was brushing his teeth or some shit, and got all emotional, started bawling, and decided to get a hold of Leon Russell and see if they could make an album together. And Leon Russell was toiling. So Elton John got together with him, said, let's make a record, and got T-Bone Burnett to produce it. And the result was they both went into the studio with a bunch of Bernie Taupin lyrics, and they just sat down together and started playing. And these songs came out of it. Now, some of the songs Elton John went to write by himself. One of them, I think, that the huge standout on the album is called Gone to Shiloh, and it's a duet with Elton, Leon Russell, and Neil Young makes a performance singing harmony and singing a verse. And the thing about that album, too, is that they're both playing piano in every song. And the way that they are able to, Elton John's basically playing a rhythm piano, while Leon Russell is playing a lead piano, and they're separated, Leon Russell on the right channel, Elton John on the left channel, so you can always tell who's doing what. Big old brass, T-Bone Burnett sort of organic capturing of hearkening back to the Tumbleweed Connections, some of the Madman types of sounds. It's a brilliant album, and it I had said earlier in the show, debuted at number 3 on the American charts, highest debut since Blue Moves. And he did a tour with T-Bone Burnett's band that he put together for this album. There was no Davy Johnstone in this case. There was no Nigel. It was T-Bone Burnett's dudes. And so they went on tour for a while with that, and then with Leon Russell. And then Leon Russell made a couple of bucks and got inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame at this point, and bragged that he got to buy a new tour bus. So good on him, and good on Elton revitalizing his career and making a very successful album. It was one of the albums that you saw at Starbucks. You know, people were actually buying it on a whim while they were waiting for their latte. And it did very, very, very well. So he continued this tour. After a while, the Leon Russell band took off, and he went back to his regular band, continuing the Union tour, doing Vegas and everything. And he also wrote the musical Billy Elliot, I think a little bit earlier, but that was going. So The Lion King was turned into a Broadway musical, so he had that running. Aida was touring, Billy Elliot was on Broadway, so he's got his hands in a million pots. Meanwhile, still touring, hundreds, over 100 shows a year, probably closer to 200. And the thing that I love about that is it's because he loves music. It's not, he doesn't fucking need the money. The guy's worth like $500 million. He could live off his royalties in multiple houses and the most lavish lifestyle you could possibly imagine just by collecting royalties. But he's out there all the time because he's obsessed with music. He listens to everything. As a matter of fact, just the other day, there was an article about him going into a Vancouver record store and looking for Tech Nine gangster rap albums. That's what he does. And I think it's a testament to someone who loves music that he listens to everything. And not only that, but he plays just to play. And I'm sure he doesn't mind the money. He's got 2 adopted kids now. Or not adopted. They were artificial insemination. So 2 kids, 2 boys. And what it makes me think of is the fact that he once said if he wasn't a musician, he would have worked in a record store and played music on the weekends. And I have absolutely no doubt that that is completely true. And it makes me think of not everybody can make it as a musician. Sometimes you gotta get the job. You gotta get the day job. But you shouldn't stop. And I know that if he had not become famous, you'd still be able to go to some fucking pub in England and see that dude play. And that's the way it should be for all of us, I think, right? If you play, keep playing. You got to go work some 9 to 5. That's fine. Don't fucking put your guitar in the garage. Keep it there. Play it. Right. Do it. Anyway, that's my one of my many inspirations from this guy's career. So we get to 2013, and he taps T-Bone Burnett once again to do an album called The Diving Board. And this album was stripped down to mainly bass, drums, and piano, which is what he started with, obviously, at the Troubadour. Now, on this album, T-Bone Burnett picked his own guys again, so it's basically the same band as The Union. My one downfall with that album, because I think it's great, I think it's the recording is very well done in this sort of tape hiss, parlor sounding, perfect for vinyl album. Great songs across the board. Bernie Taupin kicking ass on the lyrics through and through. But there are songs in there that I was like, I wish Nigel was playing this. I'd love to hear Davy Johnstone throw in a little something. So that's the only thing I think that album lacks. But he followed it up in the next year, in 2015, the release of his next album was called Wonderful Crazy Night. Once again, T-Bone Burnett, but this time with his own band. And the recording, just to show the brilliance of T-Bone Burnett, the album sounds so much different than The Diving Board because it's an upbeat rock album. There's not a lot of ballads. And it has like the feel of a festival wherein The Diving Board felt like, a little parlor, the kind of thing that you'd play like before the bar is closing and you're hanging out smoking cigarettes. Wonderful Crazy Night was what you would want to drive around blasting in your car at summertime, except for that the songs suck. It's like Peachtree Road. It's an attempt by Elton to push forward his happiness now, because he's a very happy dude. I saw him that same year that album came out, and I've seen him like 10 times. I went there expecting to see, run-of-the-mill garden variety Elton John concert, and I would have been fine with that. But he had the energy of a 25-year-old. I couldn't believe it. The show was like 3 hours, extended jams on all kinds of songs. He's just ripping apart the piano. His voice is shot now. I mean, let's be honest. He had the nodes. He came back from that. He sounded really good for a while, but eventually, when you're out there every single night, his voice is taking a beating. It's lower. He can't hit any of the high notes. He plays some songs transposed these days, but the energy made up for that in so many spades that you didn't care. And so he wanted to carry over that happiness to Wonderful Crazy Night, and the vibe is there. It sounds great. It's produced great. The musicianship is great. But Bernie Taupin trying to write 10 happy songs is going to result in bad songs. So, yeah, there's hooks, there's moments, but most certainly I wouldn't put it on the level of The Big Picture or Leather Jackets or Victim of Love or anything like that. But it's like a Peachtree Road type of thing. Pick it up and listen to it if you'd like, but do it more for the production value rather than the songs. Although there is a song on there called Clawhammer, which is would be worthy of any of his 70s efforts. Which brings us to today, at the age of 70. No big concert for his 70th birthday. When he turned 60, he did a show at Madison Square Garden where he played a set of like 500 songs. Not really, but I mean a lot of songs. And he pulled out songs like Ballad of a Well-Known Gun and Holiday Inn and what's that song? The High Flying Bird song that we covered. The great Carla Kane, Alan Clapp, Coy Wynn, Charlie Crabtree. Little plug for our own band, William Cleere and the Marvelous Fellows. We covered that song, did a good job on it. But Elton John kicked that song's ass in his 60th birthday show at Madison Square Garden. But nothing like that this year. Just, family and friends birthday party. But that's not to say that he's stopping touring. He is booked through December, the last time I checked. On and on and on the wheel goes. The Rocket Man soars. Bernie Taupin keeps writing. Davy Johnstone, Nigel Olsson, still along for the ride. It's amazing, and it should be inspiring, I think, to anyone, especially if you're a musician, that, as the Grateful Dead once said, the music never stopped, and neither does Elton John. So happy birthday, my friend. I hope you all have enjoyed the show. I hope it gave you some information that you didn't already know. You were able to glean something from it. And our next show will be, well, not the next show. The next show is going to be about aliens, but the show after that will be another birthday celebration for the 40th birthday of Star Wars. And we will definitely have Charlie Crabtree, as we do with all Star Wars shows, or most of them. Other Star Wars shows we've done is with Bob Chastain and Bob Mary, and if all goes well, folks, all four of them for a long, laughing look at the history of Star Wars and how great it is, just like Elton John's great. Thanks for listening. Cue the hot chick.
Pop Talk and Aliens, the William Cleere Podcast.